South Africa is still reeling from the allegations by US Ambassador Ruben Brigitte that the country illegally exported weapons to Russia despite its professed non-aligned stance. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Unfiltered. I'm your host, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. Now, these allegations are yet to be verified, but they're set against a deeper backdrop of global power shifts, BRICS, and questions as to the authenticity of South Africa's international commitments to the International Criminal Court. All of these questions come to bear on tonight's topic, and to help us unpack where we are in this intriguing geopolitical time, we're joined by Emma Powell, who is the Shadow Minister for International Relations of the Democratic Alliance, Dr. William Mpofu, researcher at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, and Oleksiy Melnik, the co-director of Foreign Relations and International Security Programs at the Razumkov Center in Ukraine. Before we dive into our discussion, let's have a look at this insert for some context around our conversation.
Since the Ukrainian war broke out, thousands of casualties have been registered by the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. Combatant casualties from both the Russian and Ukrainian side of the war have also been registered by various parties, but the actual numbers of soldier casualties are a source of deep contestation depending on which side of the war one is. Also under serious contestation are global power shifts, which have been made more pronounced by this war, seen as a proxy for many political and economic interests of powerful countries. Experts say the Russian-China-US relationship has become a global question, and the rest of the world has to choose sides on which argument makes sense ideologically and economically. With South Africa's long history of relations with the former Soviet Union, the country and others in the so-called Global South have decided to take a non-aligned position on this war. But if the SAU's ambassador's allegations of illegal weapons exports are true, South Africa's claim as a non-aligned, human rights insisting country will be tarnished. Along with other countries which choose to be non-aligned, they have chosen to either abstain or vote against United Nations resolutions against Russia, insisting on the origin of the conflict to be interrogated and for fair solutions to be found. On the other hand, countries that belong to the Third World are raising more of their voices as they seek a more independent world. And as the clock is ticking towards the August meeting of the BRICS nations, seen as rising competition to the G20, as more countries are reported to be expressing interest in joining the BRICS countries, pressure is mounting on former superpowers to ensure that they do not lose their status. Even more unsettling are talks of de-dollarization, which a number of countries are mooting as part of their efforts towards their own autonomy. But with one of the world's highest poverty levels, some are questioning whether South Africa can afford to alienate the United States and its allies when their investments are needed to boost its faltering economy. In the melting pot of events that collide for a perfect storm is also the looming deadline for the review of the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA, which since 2000 has been giving African states preferential access to US markets, with South Africa currently being the main beneficiary from around 7,000 products.
In the existing legislation for AGOA, there is already a requirement that no recipient of AGOA privileges should take actions that are directly in contrast to the national security interests of the United States of America.
On the other hand, bilateral trade between Russia and South Africa amounted to 16.4% last year. Is it time for pragmatism, and what does pragmatism mean in a country where the majority of citizens are hungry? Is the US and its allies nervous about the rising global south and willing to do anything to maintain their erstwhile positions? And where does this put the citizens of the world as global powers battle it out for dominance? Andrew Mokhatle for Unfiltered, SABC News.
Welcome back to Unfiltered, and let's get into our conversation this evening. Mr. Melnick, it's rare on our South African screens to have a voice who has been in senior positions in Ukraine. What's your assessment, firstly, of the situation on the ground at this moment?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I've been to South Africa a long time ago, and today I'm very pleased to be again in South Africa, at least virtually. My current assessment that there is still ongoing fighting, a very high level of violence on the front, which is like 1,500 kilometers long. And for the last 6 months, it's been stabilized already, and now we are on the stage of expecting Ukrainian offensive operation. And most probably in the coming days or weeks, we will see another escalation of the conflict.
What do you think of the narrative that this has reached a stalemate and is likely to continue for a long time, as US Professor John Mearsheimer has recently suggested?
I would agree that the Russian offensive has reached a stalemate, because Russian forces has tried to conduct offensive operations since last December, and actually at the end of March there were mostly positional battles, and that's why I don't think that we can speak about stabilization in general on this front, because again, I repeat, Ukraine has been working hard to conduct another successful counteroffensive operation in the coming weeks.
And just to stay with you, and if we can bring South Africa into the picture, of course, there have been these recent allegations by the US ambassador to South Africa that South Africa exported weapons under the cover of darkness to Russia. What is your assessment and reaction to those allegations?
It would be extremely unpleasant news if these allegations are confirmed, but so far I haven't seen any confirmation. Moreover, if you look back, let's say 10 years, there was actually no arms trade between the two countries. And I think that there could be an attempt of some commercial companies to assist Russia in their hunger for finding artillery shells or Soviet-made equipment all around the world. But at the end of the day, there was, again, no confirmation of the South African government involved, and I think it was a kind of preventive signal for South Africa government to watch more carefully and to avoid any transition of weapons or any military support for Russia.
That's quite interesting. Just before I bring the other guests in, because to hear from the Ukrainian side that you're also not sure about the verification of this and are introducing the possibility that this may not have gone, as far as I'm understanding you, necessarily to the Russian government, but that there could have been other private players in Russia, to the extent that any shipment happened, that's where you think it would have gone. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think that there could be an attempt of some private arms dealers, but there was a quite similar case with Egypt. There was an attempt or at least from the Russian side, to encourage Egypt to sell Soviet-made or Russian-made equipment and ammunition to Russia, but then at the end of the day, Egyptian government decided that it would be more beneficial for them to not have this kind of business with Russia on the current stage.
Ms. Powell, your party, the Democratic Alliance, and particularly the Shadow Defense Minister, I believe it is, has been quite adamant that there is evidence to suggest that this shipment did happen. What is that evidence,
well,
and how robust do you think that evidence is?
So the DA are deeply troubled by Ambassador Brigady's remarks that were made publicly last week. That signals that the US has got robust enough intelligence to go public, that the South African government, or at least rogue forces operating with potential tacit support and facilitation by senior leaders within government, may indeed be actively involved in arming the Russian Federation in terms of their war of aggression against Ukraine. We don't believe that, given what is at stake and the long-standing relationship that South Africa has had with the United States, it's been a relationship that's been based on a mutually beneficial goodwill. We don't believe that the United States would have come out so publicly in having made the statements that they did if their intelligence agencies did not have robust and credible evidence to substantiate the ambassador's allegations.
So can I ask you on that? Are you just trusting the US? Because we're in the situation of a major international conflict where each side has an incentive to sway global public opinion. So what if the US is wrong?
So firstly, just going back to the previous comments that were made, there were in fact 2 export permits for South Africa to supply munitions to the Russian Federation that the DA is in possession of between 2019 and 2020. So one of those was for munitions components, the other was for some form of satellite and systems devices. We know that there is a global shortage of black powder, essentially, explosives powder. And we know that with the European summer coming, Russia is hard up on munitions and would be willing to accept munitions scraps from any willing sponsor. So there are a number of indicators that South Africa does indeed have a relationship with the Russian Federation prior, of course, to the Russian Federation's invasion of a sovereign state. But the bottom line is that there is so much at risk, specifically with AGOA and that act coming up for renewal in 2025, the 100,000 domestic jobs in South Africa, the hundreds of billions rands worth of trade and preferential export that we have with the United States. I don't believe that it would be in the United States' interests to make the remarks that they had made unless there was robust and credible evidence. So it's not a case of blindly believing what the United States has to say. We, as a party, have been keeping a firm track on events over the past 18 months. And there are a number of other indications that would lead to the substantiation of the ambassador's remarks.
But that all sounds like the US wouldn't say this unless they had a good reason. But we're not sure what that good reason is. And I suppose the question is, what is that good reason? Because we can't simply believe things just because the US ambassador says he really believes them. Again, yes, there are permits. Yes, the government of the Russian Federation might want weapons. But none of that actually gives us credible information to believe at this stage that ammunition or weapons went onto that ship. And I think that's the part that seems to be missing in this debate. On both sides of it is we don't seem to actually know what happened. And until we know, it seems hard to form a solid opinion. Or do you know something that we don't?
So So we know that the South African government recently, well, a delegation from the South African government recently visited Washington, and a number of discussions were had in this regard. Those have now been made public. We know that back in February, the US Secretary for Treasury requested further investigations on the South African side into this matter. We know that the US have been nudging and waiting for South Africa to conduct an investigation on the basis of intelligence that they have, and that nothing has happened. And so this is not something that's a shot out of the blue. There have been discussions that have been going on behind the scenes for a number of months now. The bottom line is that from a party political perspective, the DA submitted a number of questions. We've submitted a Promotion of Access to Information Act request as well, asking Minister Thandi Modise to explain exactly what happened in early December. It's now been more than 5 months, almost 6 months, and government has been entirely silent. So there is, in my belief, credible and robust intelligence that the United States have. They have given South Africa an opportunity to explain and to investigate and to deal with either the rogue elements that have been facilitating these transactions or senior government ministers and leaders that have been directly involved, and nothing has happened to date. It was only once Minister Brigety went public with his shock remarks that the president, who was actually speaking at the podium in Parliament when the story broke, was forced to tell the nation that a retired judge will now be called out of retirement, essentially, to conduct investigation. So I think that there's a lot that's been going on behind the scenes that we need to be mindful of. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but we can come back.
We're going to have to leave it there. We'll leave it there because we're going to have to go to a break, but we'll come back on some of these questions as well as bring in Dr. Mpofu. Nice to see another Dr. Mpofu on the stage, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the question of Ambassador Ruben Brigety's allegations that South Africa shipped weapons or ammunition to Russia, and whether that's symptomatic of a deeper shift in global politics, at which South Africa seems to be at the center. Dr. Mpofu, before we left the break, we were just discussing this question of the actual veracity of these allegations, because a lot hinges on whether this is actually true or not. How do you react to the discussion so far, and what position do you take towards these very serious allegations, but allegations over which there is still at least some doubt?
Yeah. It's actually profitless to invest much energy in trying to judge which side is telling the truth and which side is not telling the truth. But in times of vivid geopolitics, in times of war, and in times of contestations, such times as this time that we are in, it's important that we remember that the old cliche that the first casualty of war is truth. That cliche gains some freshness when times are like this, and especially thinking, observing, and speaking from Africa, it's important to really be alive and awake to the possibility that information becomes politicized, partisanized, and even militarized. And my observation from an African standpoint would be that, true or not true, the effect of the ambassador's statement or the ambassador's allegations is wider than most of us think, in that in accusing South Africa, in challenging South Africa, and in that demonstration where the rand is experiencing some tremors, it's a statement to the rest of Africa to think away and work away from any relations, economic, political, and military, with Russia, with China, and other BRICS, members of the BRICS collective. So true or false, there is an effect in that every other African country, as we speak, is thinking twice about continuing the old relations with Russia and China because of what has been alleged against South Africa. And I would really want to press the point that in times like this, information becomes poisoned, politicized, partisanized, and even militarized. And it's important for Africans, as the longest ever victims of war and violence, to think in those terms.
What do you say to the view that, yes, of course, in war, information is, and the truth is often casualty. But here we have a situation where one country has invaded another. There's a very clear violation of international law. And Africa's position of so-called non-alignment is actually a position of complicity.
It's important that you are centering Africa and its condition and its position. And it takes us really to that incompleteness of African liberation, where African countries such as South Africa in this case are still the minors of the global, the world system, are still the children of the world system, and are still the objects of world history, where superpowers have the power to squeeze the oxygen out of any African economy, any African polity, and command that do not relate with this one, relate with that one. That alone is a demonstration of the incompleteness of the African liberatory project, where the continent is still a subject, is still an object rather than a subject of the world system, and is still a minor, a child that is told who to relate it with and who not to relate with. If Africa was liberated, if Africa had agency, if Africa was in charge of its polities and economies and its resources, there wouldn't be a superpower from the East or the West commanding who Africa should relate with or not and how. But here we are in this condition where we are these serviles, where we are these objects, and it's tragic. And talking about invasions, it's Africa that should talk to the world about invasions. It's Africa that should talk to the world about proxy wars. It's Africa that should be asking the world about international law. It's Africa that should be teaching the world about justice, because we know the most and maybe the longest.
Mr. Melnick, the position of non-alignment has been adopted, at least publicly, by many states, BRICS countries, countries from the global south. What's your view on this stance of non-alignment? Because quite frankly, we in places like South Africa are in quite a difficult position, to the extent that we're being forced to choose between two very powerful sides from our perspective. And it can be quite difficult to feel as though you're being pulled geopolitically from pillar to post. On the other hand, there are those who say that that is a position of moral equivocation and is morally blameworthy. What's your view on non-alignment in this current conflict?
First of all, I think that every state has a sovereign right to decide either to be non-aligned or to join any union that they consider beneficial for their economic or security interest. So the national choice must be respected. In our particular situation, I think the non-alignment and neutrality sounds like synonyms, but this is not the same. You may be a non-aligned state, but in a certain situation, you can't be neutral. It's like a situation on the street when you see a big guy trying to beat or over a girl, and well, it sounds nice to be neutral, but at the end of the day, if you are even not fit enough to defend a weaker person, then you have to call the police or offer your service as a witness to this conflict. Of course, you take a risk, but again, as I said, sometimes neutrality is not the best choice. So I don't see any contradiction between being non-aligned and at least trying to support a victim of the unlawful armed aggression.
Do you think that South Africa's stance of non-alignment has veered towards a harmful non-alignment, as you put it? What more do you think could be done?
At least I'm not advocating that South Africa will join some international groups like Ramstein format, that's a big, huge group of supporters, more than 50 countries that support Ukraine in its current struggle for its independence and sovereignty. But at least when it comes to voting at the UN General Assembly, I think if you don't support a resolution which condemns Russian violation of human rights, Russian war crimes, it seems like kind of silent support for these actions. And one day it may pay back and harm your own interests.
Ms. Powell, a lot's been made of our non-aligned stance, and Ambassador Brigitte effectively said that we're speaking non-alignment while practicing alignment. What's your view on the wisdom of South Africa's avowed non-alignment and whether that is in practice non-alignment?
So I personally reject the principle or taking the stance of non-alignment. I think we need to look at things in the South African context. So if we go back 30 years and remember our struggle for liberation in this nation, democracy in South Africa wasn't achieved through the barrel of a gun, and civil war was actually averted in this country because countries throughout the world who shared our progressive vision worked with us to defeat racial nationalism, oppression and tyranny. So when we look at plagues like despotism, genocide, war, these plagues are only defeated when democracies throughout the world work together to preserve a rules-based international order that respects the right to self-determination and the principle of territorial sovereignty. So I don't believe that South Africa can now turn our backs on the very values and the global solidarity that help to ensure our freedom from the grips of illegitimate rule. And I think that as the geopolitical sands continue to shift, South Africa must take a firm position on the global stage. Continentally, we lead as the engine room of Africa, and people are looking to South Africa, which is why what's going on in terms of potentially being used as a proxy is so dangerous. South Africa needs to put South Africa's interests first. And I think that our nation's key foreign policy objectives must be to promote our constitutional values. So to uphold the principles of the United Nations Charter, which includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we must advance our own key security, economic and domestic objectives through being aligned to other nations and groups of nations that share our progressive values for the world and its people. We simply can't be complicit in a war of aggression that risks undermining our domestic priorities from a trade perspective, as well as broader international peace and security.
Right. We're going to continue our conversation and look at the wider question of BRICS and the role that it's playing both in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also in geopolitics more widely. We'll be back after the break for more discussion. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Shocking allegations from the US ambassador to South Africa that we had exported munitions, weapons to Russia. And we're breaking this down, but also taking a step back and asking whether there's a deeper geopolitical power shift of which all this is symptomatic. Ms. Powell, before the break, we were talking about this question of non-alignment, but this is also a broader symptom of South Africa's multiple relationships. And it feels like we're in an interesting position because on the one hand, we can't deny that we have deep trading relationships with Europe, with the United States, with a power bloc that might be called the West, certainly many NATO countries. But on the other hand, we also are members of BRICS. And it's this question of BRICS that I want to come to, because it seems that the BRICS parties in this Russia-Ukraine conflict have actually towed a rather similar line, whether you look at India, South Africa, Brazil, that they're not going to intervene directly into this conflict. They're going to use one variant or another of this non-alignment strategy. What's your view on the extent to which BRICS has been a helpful broker and player in this wider conflict?
Well, when the United Nations passed the resolution 2 weeks ago to condemn essentially Russian aggression in Ukraine, some of the BRICS nations actually did vote in support of that. I think that we need to, it's about economics, and I think that we need to look at our most mutually beneficial trade relationships across the world in the context of our relationship with BRICS. So the EU, so the European Union as a regional bloc, the United Kingdom and the United States actually currently account for a third of South Africa's exports. That's just about 36%. And this is including things like machinery, electronics, and manufactured goods, which were in excess of 31% of that. Russia, on the other hand, accounted for 0.3% of South Africa's trade ties. If we look at foreign direct investment into South Africa over recent years, 77% of FDI, so foreign direct investment stock into South Africa, came from Western markets, so the EU, the UK, and the US. China and Russia, so BRICS nations, accounted for only 6.2% of this, and more so, we don't actually have a formal trade agreement with BRICS states at present. We're developing a BRICS development bank, but there are no formal mutually beneficial or reciprocal trade agreements in place. So what we're doing is we're playing a game of Russian roulette as a nation. And it's these dog whistle signals. So the naval exercise, the fact that one of our most senior Army Lieutenant General was in Russia yesterday conducting exercises, the landing of that aircraft at Waterkloof, the Lady R. There've been a whole bunch of what we in politics call dog whistles to the West that we're cementing our relationship with Russia. And it's potentially to the expense of the huge trade and investment that we get from the West. And I mean, just AGOA, South Africans are interested in bread and butter issues. Just AGOA, so the African Growth and Opportunity Act that we have, well, the Americans have, and they include us as an act of generosity. AGOA wasn't designed for middle-income countries like South Africa, but we were given inclusion in it. It provides almost 100,000 direct and indirect jobs in South Africa. It's about, I think the figure is about 50 billion rand a year. So
let's accept that. Right, but why would any of these countries put any of that at risk just because South Africa may or may not have at this moment exported weapons under the cover of darkness? Wouldn't that be a kind of attempt to put economic trade over the barrel of a geopolitical gun, when in actual fact they don't just trade with us out of the goodness of their hearts? We have a lot to offer them, and that's why they trade with us. So it seems that there's an argument being made that we should be placed in a position to be, in a way, forced to take a geopolitical position just because of the economic position. And isn't that unfair?
I hear you, and I think that you ask a very valid question, and I think all of us in this room are interested in putting South Africa first. But ultimately, nation states such as the USA are certainly not going to keep nations like South Africa party to beneficial trade agreements when they know that nations such as South Africa may be actively funding a war of aggression in a sovereign state. Because we have to think about what kind of a world we're creating, and we build our relationships on that basis. I know that President Ramaphosa would certainly not have sent such a senior delegation to Washington in the past 2 weeks if AGOA wasn't genuinely at risk. And as I say, AGOA was designed for far poorer economies than South Africa. It was an act of goodwill on the part of the United States to include South Africa. Let's look at things like fruit or wine exports. Those could very easily be replaced by other nations. places like Australia, for example. So AGOA is at risk. The Americans have told us that AGOA is at risk. We know it is at risk. And that's because of the clause, and I wrote it down, that no recipient of AGOA may be an actor that is acting in direct contrast of the United States obligations in terms of international law and their mission. So whether or not we like it or we think it's right, I think it's very arrogant for us as a nation to say, well, actually, they need us just as much as we need them. We know that that's not true.
Dr. Mpofu?
Yeah, I think there is the danger of economicism, whereby issues of social justice and even issues of truth are going to be sacrificed on the altar of economic interest. And it's not by some god or some ancestor that Africa finds itself in this dependent position economically. It's not by natural design that Africa finds itself in this vulnerable position where it's dependent for its political and economic oxygen on some powers from elsewhere, east or west. It's because of a long history of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation. I mean, African thinkers have taught us, Walter Rodney, about how Europe underdeveloped Africa, how development of Africa, economical and political, was disrupted by capitalists, colonialists, and imperialists. Yash Tandon recently wrote a good book about how the West uses trade as war against the rest. There's all the evidence about how Africa has deliberately been underdeveloped so that it can be exploited and so that it can be politically and militarily controlled by powers that be. We shouldn't find ourselves celebrating that condition.
Yeah, let's assume that's true.
Insisting that we should maintain that position and not speak back to superpowers or ask certain questions. That would be colonial to do. It would be to pander on the same imperialism and colonialism that put Africa here.
Let's assume that's true. What then for African states, given the inequalities that are inherent in the global economic system? Do you think that African states are acting, or at least South Africa is acting with the wisdom required of this moment, given its power imbalances?
If Africa was liberated, if Africa was free, South Africa or any of the African country or a country of the global south should wake up in the morning and choose friends freely, choose trading partners freely, choose political and military alliances freely, without fearing for this contract, without fearing for that agreement, without fearing for that geopolitical setup that keeps the continent dependent. It's a tragedy, actually, to witness that many decades after the last African country achieved political independence from colonialism, the continent is still in that colonial and awkward position where some powers are able to switch off the lights, punch the oxygen pipe and say, if you don't do this, we will do this to you. It's to celebrate colonialism, it's to celebrate racism, and to celebrate imperialism, to actually insist that we should tone down, speak less, ask less questions, because we will go hungry.
We're continuing our conversation on the wider geopolitics of South Africa and Africa's role within the Russo-Ukrainian war. We're going to come back with a final segment after this break where we're going to be looking at the deeper and the wider question of whether there is a geopolitical shift in the world at the moment, or whether in actual fact, despite the sound and fury of BRICS and Russia and China, the only game in town is still the United States. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Mr. Melnick, I suppose the first question I'd like to ask you is, to what extent do you think this conflict and the response to it from other powers, from the global south, from BRICS, represents a deeper shift in geopolitical power in the world, away from the unipolar American moment of dominance towards a more multipolar moment of power where power is shared more widely around the globe?
Let me express some reflections on the previous part of the conversation. It's very interesting to hear the African point of view about how colonial past affected the current and the future perspectives of South Africa and other African countries. I partly agree, and this war is probably exactly about the same problem, that one of the superpowers of a country which pretends to be a superpower wants to occupy another country and to tell Ukrainians what to do, what alliance should to join or what not to do. And I think that I would disagree with the previous speaker about like destiny of small or mid-sized countries to be always subordinated to big powers' will, because one of the lessons from this war that some very small nations like Baltic states, like Poland, they have managed to shape an agenda of the European Union, and they managed to affect even the United States decision. That's probably kind of example how even a small nation, if they have a goal, if they respect their national interests, can play much greater role than the size of their territory or the size of the economy of or number of citizens alone. And I think that's one of the key lessons to be learned from the current situation.
And what of the deeper power shifts in the world? What's your thought on the extent to which this conflict is revealing those? Or do you still think that the United States wields the disproportionate share of power in global politics?
I wouldn't blame the United States for the causes of this conflict. Actually, if we talk about the role of this global power competition, this is exactly what Russia was trying to just make a justification for this conflict. They always accused the United States, they accused Europe for not treating Russia as a big power, and that was kind of an attempt to reestablish Russia as a great power in this competition. But I think it's absolutely wrong approach, and then at the end of the day, Russia will not achieve anything, but in the best case scenario will probably remain a mid-sized power, accept its nuclear status for a number of decades to come. The United States, I mean, they not probably fighting for their status as a superpower. They are the superpower, and the level of their involvement in this Russian-Ukrainian conflict is because it affects their national security interest. And I think coming to the beginning of our conversation, the main purpose of this statement made by the American ambassador is because it affects American national security interest. And this is the moment when you have to find a good balance between your economic benefits and national security interests.
What do you make, just because it's rare to have someone who's served in senior defense positions in Ukraine, of the counter-argument marshaled by some US academics as well, but mainly by the Russian side and the Russian allied side, that NATO expansion has something to do with the outbreak of this conflict?
Let me remind you that at the beginning of this conflict in 2014, when Russia first annexed the Crimean Peninsula and then started armed conflict in the east of the country, Ukraine was a non-aligned country, not formally, but Ukraine was not going to join NATO. Ukraine was just a partner of NATO. This is, I think, this argument of the Russian Federation about NATO expansion just simply ridiculous. And by the way, one of the purposes that the Kremlin wanted to achieve by starting this aggression is to prevent NATO expansion. What do we have now? They have another NATO member who joined, Finland, who joined NATO, and Sweden is about to join NATO. So Russia achieved exactly the opposite. And by the way, even Russian officials admitted that they don't see any direct threat, military threat from NATO countries.
And then just finally, from your perspective, who's actually winning this war to the extent that there is a winner?
I would agree that Russia lost this war from the very beginning. Of course, there is still a very dynamic situation on the battlefield, but we're pretty confident that Ukraine is going to win this war, no matter whether we will have the same level of support from the West, but this is the will of Ukrainian people. One of the Ukrainian high-level officials, when he was asked this question whether the Ukrainian government can accept the concessions and to stop the war, he said, yes, the government can, but Ukrainian people will keep fighting with the new government.
Dr. Mpofu, your thoughts on what's been said in general about the conflict and also the deeper geopolitical shifts that either are revealed or not revealed in this conflict? Do you think there's something deeper going on in the world right now? Or is this just another war, as there have been many, where the United States has still maintained its preeminence?
Yeah, and I want to start to look at the point that my colleague has raised on victory. It's not clear who's winning, and there might be no winner. But the loser is clear, and ultimately it's Africa that is going to be ordered, and that is going to be shaped in the interests of the powerful at the end of the day. So it's that tragedy where every war elsewhere ends up with African effects or African symptoms. And that's how terrible our condition is. There is an underlying and much deeper and much more problematic event that is taking place, and that is the shifting of the power of the empires. We have learned that empires come and go, and empires jostle for power, beginning with Sparta and Athens in Western history. And we're at that moment where we can describe this, as Professor Allison describes it, as the Thucydides trap, where two big powers cannot avoid war because power is at stake. And then the powerless countries are going to be told this truth and that truth. But what is happening is that political ground is shifting under the feet of powerful countries. And those human differences, those economic differences, those political differences, and that economic and geopolitical competition has collapsed into a war which is having its theater as Ukraine. And the theater is extending into Africa, as you can see. So there is a shift of the empires, and that is not going to go back. And Africa should be the first within the Committee of Continents to ask for a multipolar world where there's no one voice, no one power that wakes up in the morning and distributes oxygen accordingly and withdraws it accordingly. We need a liberated, multipolar world where there are no bullies, where there can be no one bully, and all that. Thank you.
Ms. Powell, your final thoughts on the conversation, anything you want to come back on, or just views that you'd like to share given how our discussion has unfolded?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a number of very valid points have been made. But I think that ultimately we need to be pragmatic in our discussions and in our deliberations. We need to look at, firstly, what kind of a country we want to create, and secondly, what kind of a world we want to live in. So we can align ourselves with nations such as China and Russia, who have got horrific track records of racism, homophobia, human rights abuses, suppression of dissidents. Or we can align ourselves with democracies who believe in upholding human rights and the intrinsic value of all people. I also think it's something that must be said is that there has been a huge amount of goodwill from the West towards South Africa and Africa in the post-apartheid years. I don't believe that South Africa is randomly being used as a proxy. I think that it is the ANC's dalliance with Russia that is creating this problem. I think that from a global perspective, the United Nations, an overwhelming number of members of the United Nations have already recognized that Russia has committed aggression in Ukraine. And the simple fact here is that by providing any form of assistance or ammunition to Russia, South Africa would be directly aiding and abetting the use of force against Ukraine. And that is a serious violation of international law. As a constitutionalist myself, I stand with the international community of democracies. I believe in a territory's right to be sovereign, to self-determine, as all African states would want for themselves. And I think that we need to look at our values, and we need to go back to our constitution and what it is that we believe as a nation in terms of the sides that we pick on this conflict. I think non-alignment is dangerous, but I do agree with the previous speaker that we want to live in a multipolar world. We do not want to see the reemergence of the dangerous bipolarity that characterized the Cold War era.
Just because we have a little bit left, in 30 seconds, though, I have to take you up on the human rights record of the United States, even Great Britain, internally and externally. Not exactly a spotless record either, though. Certainly, if you go back in history from colonialism to slavery, racial injustice, or are you saying it's about the record recently?
Yeah, so I mean, the history and absolutely colonialism in Africa, in South Africa, slavery, the separation of people on the basis of race is horrific. It is a crime against humanity, and it must be condemned in the strongest terms. I'm talking about, and that's why I spoke about being pragmatic and not emotional. I'm speaking about things in the current context. I think that there is a lot of good work being done in the United States and in many democracies across the world to recognize and to make good on the sins of our forefathers. And I think that if we keep hauling up the past, not diminishing the pain, it is certainly not my place to diminish anybody's pain. I think we must recognize pain. But I think that we need to, as leaders, be pragmatic and look at the situation as it stands now, obviously recognizing the pain that has come before.
Ms. Powell, Mr. Melnick, Dr. Mpofu, thank you for a very interesting discussion. Thank you for your insights from multiple perspectives as we've tried to dissect the conflict that rages on between Russia and Ukraine, also the global geopolitical power shifts that are happening, and South Africa's role in all of this, from BRICS right the way through to the recent allegations that we have been supplying ammunition or weapons to the Russian Federation. I hope this helped to enlighten your views on this question, and we'll see you again for another installment of Unfiltered.